It's no secret that the Dexter show is significantly different from the books it's based on, and one of the characters whose story is completely different is Sergeant James Doakes. But aside from having his own dark passenger, how else is Doakes different in the books? Number 1. Doakes' plotline. The first major difference between Doakes in the show and the books is the lack of his presence. Believe it or not, Doakes is a minor character in the books. In the show, we see Doakes as this big bad cop who is always ready to dish out justice. He has no time for bullshit and can smell it from a mile away. He tirelessly bullies Dexter and senses his real nature beneath his facade. He tries to uncover his secret and meets his demise when he finally does. All in all, Doakes is considered a major character in the few seasons he was present in. He was in all the episodes of season 1 and 2, and after his death, he appeared in a flashback in season 7, episode 12, Surprise Motherfucker.
Surprise, motherfucker.
In the books, on the other hand, he has very few appearances and they are far in between. There's no plotline of his chasing after Dexter like a hound, even though he senses that something is not right about Dexter. There's no elaborate investigation, no witty back and forth between him and Dexter, just sheer professionalism when he's not glaring daggers at him. There's barely any mention of his military past, no mention of a family member, or even a friend. He gets no character building in the books and is honestly unrelatable. Doakes in the show and Doakes in the books are completely different people. It's amazing how the show is able to portray Doakes the way it does when the inspiration for him is lacking. His personality also has a major downgrade in the books. Number 2, Doakes' personality. Doakes' personality in the show is far more complex and interesting. We know a lot about Doakes in the show. He grew up in a possibly abusive home, he was married at some point, and he even had 2 sisters and a mother who wanted him around the house more often. We know that despite his incessant bullying, it's clear that some sense of justice drives him. Doakes in the show had a working moral compass and a strong sense of right and wrong. We can hardly call Doakes a lover boy, but the few tender moments we see with his woman are sincere and heartwarming. Though by woman, I'm not talking about his ex-wife, but the wife of his fellow cop whom he had an affair with in season 1. In season 1, episode 2, Crocodile, an undercover cop, Ricky Simmons, gets killed in the line of duty. Doakes and LaGuerta go to check up on his wife only to find her dying on her living room floor. Doakes has a look of distress on his face and stoops low to whisper, "Kara, it's me. It's James."
Police back up now. I'll check the house.
Kara, it's me. It's James. You okay?
Using his first name is the first indication that they knew each other on a personal level. Even Maria finds his actions strange and questions him later. He admits to having an affair with his colleague's wife, and he doesn't stop himself from taking care of her in the hospital. He even went as far as to challenge the criminal responsible for her death, knowing and not caring that it would put a target on his back. I praised him for his sense of right and wrong a few moments ago, and while the affair is wrong, it just shows that Doakes is only human after all. Even during his fling with Maria when they were partners, he shows some level of care for her. Apart from being just and caring, Doakes in the show is also a cool co-worker, at least on some days. His relationship with Deborah Morgan was unlike the one he had with her brother Dexter. He encouraged her, humored her ideas like in the Tony Tucci fiasco, and didn't put her down as LaGuerta did. Despite his hard exterior in the show, Doakes isn't heartless and unmovable. In season 2, episode 10, There's Something About Harry, Dexter kills a man in the cabin to frame Doakes. Doakes is shocked at the ritual killing and is terribly affected by it. By the time Dexter is done, Doakes is sitting on the floor with his back turned to him. He tells Dexter to leave him alone, and his obvious distress shows that he's not as tough as people make him out to be. Another aspect of Doakes' personality in the show is his wit and humor. When he's not trying to intimidate people, he's actually funny. Like when he says this to Dexter when investigating the bloody hotel room in season 1, episode 10, Seeing Red.
He's not kidding. It's your wet dream in there.
Okay.
And when he says this as Dexter is behaving like a creep on a crime scene.
You getting a goddamn hard on there, Morgan?
And let's not forget the most iconic Dexter scene of all time.
Surprise, motherfucker.
Are you following me now?
In summary, Doakes in the show has a lot of personality. His book counterpart, on the other hand, is boring to say the least. Doakes' personality in the books is more one-dimensional. He is portrayed as a tough, no-nonsense cop with a chip on his shoulder, but there is little exploration of his inner life or emotional struggles. His character serves more as a plot device than a fully realized individual. There's no in-depth discussion of his military background. The little that was mentioned about it had no impact on his personality. He has no love interest, no humor, and is completely unmemorable. No wonder he wasn't mentioned often. But there was something a little special about Doakes in the books. Number 3. Doakes' dark passenger. Yes, Dexter is not the only one with a dark passenger. A couple of other people also do, but we're focusing on Doakes here. In the books, the concept of a dark passenger is less psychological and more supernatural. The dark passenger is more than just an urge pushing someone to kill, and more like an entity that can be related with and even conversed with to some degree. In the first book, Darkly Dreamy Dexter, while Dexter is thinking, he talks to his dark passenger but gets no reply apart from a distant chuckle. This is one major difference between the books and the show. The books have more supernatural and fantastical elements to it, while the show did everything possible to stick with logic. In the same book, when Dexter is lost in his thoughts, Doakes catches his eye and says this: "Who are you talking to? You got somebody else in there with you?" Dexter says that his inside turns to jelly at Doakes' words. He begins to wonder if Doakes has a dark passenger too and thinks this to himself. What did he mean by "in there with me"? Could he possibly know about the dark passenger? Impossible, unless Doakes knew me for what I was. The thing inside calls out across the emptiness when it sees its own kind. Was Sergeant Doakes carrying a dark passenger too? In the show, Dexter hints at something similar in season 2, episode 10, There's Something About Harry, when Doakes discovers his secret.
So do I. I caught you.
I'm not a killer.
You are. That's why you've always known what I am. That's why you have more officer-related shootings than anybody else.
Dexter implies that Doakes has him figured out because he's just like him. But because the supernatural tones of the novel are not explored in the show, not much is said further than that. Later on in the books, we find out about Doakes' dark past in the CIA and how he might have been shaped by the trauma. But one thing remains the same in both the books and show. Doakes is better at controlling his dark urges than Dexter. The next major difference between Doakes in the books and in the series is how he relates with Dexter. Number 4. Doakes' relationship with Dexter. Doakes and Dexter's relationship in the show is slightly different from the books, but I think it's worth mentioning. In the show, their relationship is filled with tension and an underlying hatred for each other. Their relationship is characterized by mutual disdain and a cat and mouse dynamic, with Doakes constantly trying to uncover Dexter's secrets. This disdain is mainly seen on Doakes' part. From the very first episode, he bullies Dexter relentlessly, calling him things like creep and psycho. This animosity only intensified as the show progressed. While solving the ice truck killer case, Dexter gave Doakes more reasons to suspect him with his odd behavior, strange disappearances, and access to information before the cops at Miami Metro. In season 2, following the discovery of his victims' watery graves, Dexter couldn't help but act more suspiciously and disappear even more frequently so he could keep up with Agent Lundy. This triggered Sergeant Doakes' already sensitive nose, making him dig deeper and deeper into Dexter. Now, before this intense investigation of Dexter, Doakes was just a suspicious coworker and the only one in the entire Miami Metro Police Department who saw through Dexter's fake personality. But once Doakes starts getting too close for comfort, Dexter's hatred for him really begins to show. Doakes even goes as far as listening to tapes of Harry Morgan and Dexter's biological mother, Larry Moser, talking. Combined with Doakes harassing Camilla Fig for files on the shipping yard massacre, Dexter decides to get rid of Doakes. But the code doesn't allow Dexter to kill Doakes since he's innocent, so he settles for getting him suspended in season 2, episode 7, That Night a Forest Grew.
I want your gun, your badge, and your police ID. I want your access card, too. Now! Type a statement that Sergeant Doakes is on administrative leave pending an internal affairs investigation.
With extra time on his hands, Doakes doubles down on his investigation of Dexter. He catches him red-handed while he's disposing of body parts, and Dexter locks him in a cage. During this period, Doakes and Dexter have a few conversations that go beyond their usual back and forth with insults. Everyone in the police department knows that the Bay Harbor Butcher is targeting bad guys. While Doakes doesn't approve of Dexter's methods, he respects the work he's done on some level. Dexter, on the other hand, gives Doakes his flowers for picking up the creepy vibes off of him, while others are oblivious. He respects the fact that Doakes pursued relentlessly, even though it was very inconvenient for him. In another life and in different circumstances, the two of them would have been an unstoppable duo. So in the show, their relationship is a complex mix of suspicion, contempt, and mutual respect. But in the books, it's a slightly different ballgame. Doakes' relationship with Dexter in the books is pure hostility. Now, you might think that's not different from the show, but hear me out. These two really hate each other. In chapter 19 of the first book in the series, Darkly Dreaming Dexter, Dexter describes how Doakes stares at him one time. Sergeant Doakes stared at me from 3 feet away, just inside the stairwell, 1 foot on the first step. His face was a dark carved mask of curious hostility, like a Rottweiler that wants to rip your arms off but is mildly interested in knowing first what flavor you might be. Now, Doakes gives Dexter a couple of curious and suspicious looks in the show, but this is a different level. The outright hatred surprised me when I read this line, but this was mild compared to what Dexter does to Doakes. In the show, Dexter cares a bit about Doakes' life. He decides not to end his life and instead frames him as the Bay Harbor Butcher. While Doakes' death greatly benefited him, it was clear that it affected him in some way. However, in the books, Dexter feels absolutely nothing about Doakes. Doakes is targeted by a killer, and we'll talk more about this later on. Deb tries to get Dexter to come up with ideas on where the killer could have taken Doakes, but Dexter is reluctant. It takes almost an entire chapter to convince him to participate in the search for Doakes. A book character, Chutsky, tells Dexter that they need to find Doakes and that he's one of their guys. Dexter explicitly states that Doakes is not one of his guys and that the killer will leave town when he's done, so why bother searching for him? Dexter in the show would never have said something so cold-hearted, at least not out loud. After he reluctantly finds Doakes, it's obvious that he doesn't care a bit about what happened to him. He looks at the killer's work on Doakes like a fascinated student, and it creeps me out how little he cares for Doakes' well-being, unlike his show counterpart who avenges Doakes' murder.
You killed an innocent man.
I did it for you.
I gotta admit, because Doakes has less presence in the books than in the show, it looks like show Doakes hates Dexter more than book Doakes. But considering how little their interactions are in the books and how every single interaction is filled with hatred and spite, book Doakes 100% hates Dexter, while Doakes in the show probably hates him about 90%. So far, we've seen a couple of differences between book Doakes and show Doakes, but this next one is hands down the craziest one. I gotta warn you, it's pretty gruesome. Number 5. Doakes' fate. And the way Doakes meets his end in the show is a far cry from his fate in the books. In the show, Doakes catches Dexter when he's throwing bodies in the water. He struggles with Dexter and manages to shoot him in the leg, but in the end, Dexter overpowers him and takes him to a cabin where he locks him up in a cage. Doakes and Dexter go back and forth about his release, but Dexter doesn't cave in. Instead, he plots to frame Doakes and even kills a guy in front of him, which greatly disturbs Doakes. After Doakes escapes and almost gets killed by drug dealers, Dexter brings him back to the cabin and locks him up again. Lila West, Dexter's obsessed side piece, tries to track Dexter down. In season 2, episode 11, Left Turn Ahead, Dexter goes to Lila's place to tell her to drop her rape charges against Angel Batista. He leaves with a cryptic message saying that by the next day she won't see him anymore and it would be pointless to hold on to him.
After tomorrow, I won't be around anymore, so there's no end game in this for you.
You're going somewhere?
Dexter refuses to tell Lila where he's going, and this fuels her need to find out his location. She breaks into his car and checks his GPS, where she sees the lake house as one of the previous locations Dexter visited. She goes to the lake house, but instead of Dexter and Rita having a romantic getaway, as she probably assumes, she sees Doakes locked in a cage. After seeing only Dexter for days, Lila was a breath of fresh air to Doakes, a potential rescuer. In season 2, episode 12, British Invasion, after Lila gets into the lake house, she asks Doakes who he is and who put him in a cage. After he says Dexter's name and that he is the Bay Harbor Butcher, Lila rethinks her role as his rescuer.
Poor thing, all alone.
I'm okay. Just open the gate.
Not you. Dexter.
As soon as Lila says this, Doakes has a look of disbelief on his face. You can see the exact moment he realizes that this was not his rescue mission. Lila throws the key to the floor, turns on the gas, and leaves the lake house with Doakes inside. Doakes scrambles for the key, opens the cage, and runs to the door, but Lila locks it on her way out. Full of despair and with no other option left, he tries to turn the gas off, but it's too late. It explodes, we lose Doakes as a beloved character, and his name is forever smeared as the Bay Harbor Butcher. The way Doakes ends up in the books is so wildly different that it's almost unbelievable. In the books, Doakes doesn't die, but he certainly wishes he did. In the books, there are a couple of killers that we don't see in the show, and for a good reason. One of those killers is a man called Dr. Donko. Dr. Donko and Doakes have a history. Donko was part of a covert CIA team that included Doakes and others. During their missions, the team was involved in brutal interrogations and torture, and Donko was left behind and presumed dead after a mission went wrong. He survived, but he was horrifically disfigured and traumatized. Donko blames his former teammates, including Doakes, for abandoning him and leaving him to suffer. His goal is to exact revenge by torturing them in the same way he was tortured, making them invisible by surgically removing their limbs and facial features while keeping them alive. One by one, Dr. Donko goes after his former teammates. The other guys die, but before Donko can finish off Doakes, Dexter finds him. When Dexter sees Doakes, this is what he has to say. He was strapped securely in place, motionless, even his newly shaved head clamped tight to the table. I could not see too many details, but from what I could see, both his hands were gone at the wrist. And that was just what Dexter could see at that point. Dr. Donko also cut off Doakes' feet along with his tongue. For the rest of the book series, Doakes remains that way, and it's pretty sad to see our favorite like that. No wonder they didn't include that in the show. It's just too dark for TV.